This is how to make dubstep, aka all the main tips and tricks that you need to know to make it. Step number 1, make your color palette.
Now all a color palette is you going through and choosing all the sounds that you want to use in your project before you actually start arranging everything.
You can do this in audio and in MIDI. Now this is the equivalent of a painter picking and mixing all their colors before they actually paint something, just to kind of get the ideas flowing. You don't have to do this, but I find it helps. Now onto the drop arrangement. I always like to start with the drop, especially when it comes to dubstep. And the first thing I try to do is find the root idea, or the root note if you're making a melody. What is the root note? It's the main idea that you circle back to through every single section in a song. Okay, so here's my idea. In the red is the root note, and then this is the pattern. And my drop will return to that basic idea in every single section. It doesn't have to be exact, but it has to be that basic rhythm. So you'll see this is the first one. Here's a second one with a slight bit of variation. And then this is the third variation. Now the idea is that no matter what we do here, no matter how much stuff we throw in, no matter how many sounds, the drop will always return to this basic rhythm. This basic idea. That with this, the reason you want to do this is it's what makes it musical. It is the foundation of what music is. It's patterns, and the first part of the pattern is the most important. It is what lays the groundwork for the rest of, you know, the song to come. You find this in guitar music, classical music. Every melody returns to the first note at least halfway through it, if not 3 or 4 times inside of it. Listen to your favorite melody, you will hear it. But this is a must with music. If you're having issues with making arrangements and drops, just try this, just a basic pattern, and you'll find writing the rest of the drop or the rest of your melody a lot easier. Now, speaking of root notes, we need to talk about call and response. Now, usually your root note is the call, and whatever you have after it is the response. So in my track here, this is the call, and this is the response. Now this is a call, this is a response. Let it all play out, and you'll kind of hear call, response, up and down. You can hear how it's bouncing back and forward, and that's really important because it's basically like having an overall rhythm inside your track while you have your rhythms occurring. Rhythm inception. This is extremely important because it's another one of those things that allows your listeners to predict what's going to happen. It allows them to groove, it allows them to dance. It's what gives them the movement in their body if they were going to actually dance to the track. And this happens in melodies too. A really good example of this would be Scary Monsters and Nice Sprites, because we all know it, and that melody is so iconic and impactful. And a really big reason for that is it has great call and response. Listen to it, you will hear exactly what I'm talking about in that melody. In fact, that whole track itself has great call and response, which is probably why it was the dubstep track to bring everything into the mainstream fold. Now we're going to talk about checkerboarding. What is checkerboarding? Basically, the idea is don't overlap your dubstep sounds. I'm not talking the drums, the snares, and the hi-hats. Of course, you have to build a track around the dubstep sounds, but anything that is a quote-unquote dubstep sound, like a growl or a whip or anything like that, or like a yoink or whatever you want to call the sounds, it should not be occurring while another one of those sounds is occurring, except for very rare and purposeful sound design choices. Kind of like that trend that has been going on in like tear out stuff where you hear like a wah 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 and a loud sort of screech bass kind of occurring at the same time. That kind of works, but at the same time it's only 2 elements and they're both usually in very different octaves in the frequency spectrum, so keep that in mind. A big reason you also want to do this is it makes doing your mix downs extremely easy, and dubstep being, in my opinion, one of the hardest genres to mix, you want it to be as easy as possible. Okay, so I'm going to break it down for you. This is a basic checkerboarding pattern. Now we have the black and the red, you know, kind of to mimic the colors of the checkerboard, just so you guys can get a good visual representation, but you'll realize that none of the bass sounds are occurring at the same time. So let me play it for you. Just the bass sounds and nothing else. You can hear how there's still a lot of room left in the frequency spectrum because everything is cut out. And actually, if I really wanted to get into more detail, I could cut out some reverb and delays in this to like actually clean up the mix even more, but I kind of liked how this sounded. Now I'll give you an example of it sounding bad. See how that's really cluddy, muddy, staticky? It just doesn't sound really well. That is a big reason why checkerboarding is so important. It will make your song sound more rhythmic, make it easier to dance to, makes the mixdown a whole lot easier, and is just the way you're supposed to do it. Except for, of course, those very rare occasions like I mentioned before. And speaking of checkerboarding, call and response and all that, let's talk about turnarounds. Turnaround is basically something that occurs in your drop or rhythmic section that is a complete switch up from what's been occurring. So let's just play the bass sounds in this track, and then you're going to hear a vocal turnaround at the end. Now you'll hear it when I play it. It is that. Open my mouth. This can be drums, synths, vocal chops in this instant, or just even like a vocal line from a song. Basically, it breaks up the monotony of the call and response and of the checkerboarding pattern and adds in a new surprising element. And this usually occurs either in the middle of the drop or at the end of the drop. So if this is the first quarter of your song, second, third, fourth, it would occur in the middle, on the second, or on the fourth at the very end here, right before it goes on to the next section of the song. Now, it usually occurs there because those are the transitions, those are the most impactful moments, those are where the turnarounds usually occur. So now that I've sat here and bored you about all the stuff that you need to know about actually writing drops and things to keep in mind while you're doing it, I'm going to actually display myself doing it for you. That way you can kind of see what's going on. So as you'll see, I have my root patterns right here and my turnarounds right here. But yeah, let's write something. Now let's take this and copy it over. Duplicate these. And now we're basically just going to remix the first thing we did. Let's take out the spots that are going to interact with the turnaround because that's important. All right, now we got 2 done, so let's do the same thing and keep grinding on. Now, one thing I like to do is I like to make my third part match the first a bit because it feels like it's more of a kind of call and response with the actual sections themselves. So I'm going to only change a couple little things in here, but the fourth one you can kind of really get crazy and change stuff up. All right, and I'll play the whole thing through so you can hear what we've done. Oops, I should have taken this part out right here, but you can hear how it interfered with it. Not perfect, but you get the idea of basically how I'm just taking little ideas I've had, remixing them, and just tweaking little things here and there, and you can get all brand new cool ideas to allow you to write extremely quickly. But really all I was doing there was just changing the LFO rate and playing with the pitch and transpose if I was working in audio, but I was working MIDI. I got all these really cool different sounding textures and ideas and rhythms from basically 2 Serum sounds. So, you don't really need to have 50, instances of Serum or any VST open to make a really cool and interesting dubstep track. You really just have to get creative with what you have and basically just keep remixing little ideas that you have, and you'll be on the right path. You just have to have a solid root note foundation and you'll be good to go. And the same method applies to making another drop if your song has more than 1 drop, which hopefully it does if it's a dubstep track. Just copy the first one you made and start remixing that entire thing, or you can go through the same process again. It's up to you. Possibilities are limitless. And also, don't just work in MIDI because I do. That's just my preference. Because I also work in audio, but I usually get my main ideas in MIDI because I like to do a lot of my own sound design. And speaking of audio versus MIDI,
it's okay to use presets. I know a lot of people don't seem to realize this in the dubstep community, but you can use presets. A big thing that I like to do is I like to take presets and then kind of remix them and use those sounds. It's a good starting block if you don't know a lot about sound design. I mean, I've been doing sound design for longer than I've been making music, and even still, who can make just about any sound that I want from scratch, will just do the preset thing and remix the presets because usually it's faster and gets me closer to what I wanted anyways. Like if I hear a splice preset that sounds close to a sound that I want, if I just take that sound and just play around with it inside the VST, or if it's an audio file and I just take it and warp it in Ableton, like, you know, it's still your creative input and you're like changing it and making it your own thing. So one, you don't have to do that. You just, if you buy the preset, it's yours. You can do what you want with it. But
you know, it's nice to kind of put your own little touch on it. You know what I mean? It is music making. You should make something from it. Now, when it comes to the rest of the dubstep track that's not the drop, basically it's like any other track that you could make. You know, you get to choose what it is. It can be a chord progression, it can be a melody. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and break down exactly everything that I do, because every single dubstep track that I make is different, and there really isn't a set thing to do for the not drop parts. It's just the drop part's kind of so specific because dubstep as a genre is just very loud and compressed music, and you need all the space in the frequency spectrum to be able to get it to that level of loudness. And that's kind of why I broke everything down about, you know, the checkerboarding and all that stuff, just so you would be able to, when you get to the mixing part, be able to actually construct your songs in a way that you can mix them to get them to that loudness level. Like, that's why that's so important. But for the rest of the music, it's really whatever you want to do, man. It's like whatever to the heart's content. I mean, chords are usually a good place to start, especially if you're doing a melody driven kind of track. You know, make sure all the sounds are in the same key as the drop too, that way the whole song itself is cohesive, unless you're not going for that sort of cohesive sound. Or you can do what I do, where like I rap and sing at the beginning of my dubstep songs to kind of fill up the space, and plus that's kind of just what I like to do. You can put guitars, piano, it doesn't matter. It's just get creative with it. You know, that's the best part about music. It's fun and it's creative. But the verses, the A section, is not going to be as much to remember because it's not necessarily the most important part of the song. But you can still take those concepts and ideas that I went over about the drop and apply them to melodies and chords and all that, and about how you really shouldn't have too many layers occurring at the same time. That way, when you do your mix down, the verse isn't the part that's really taking up your time with the mixing. And the only other thing to really talk about is the build when it comes to arrangement, because basically whenever you do any type of build in dubstep, all you're really doing is you just keep double timing the drums, the snares, and the vocals, and pitching them up, and you know, you're just building that tension. I can show you. All right, I'll show you. You can basically see it really is just double timing everything and then pitching all the sounds. The only big thing I would point out is you want to like kind of fade the sounds, that way like all these drum like percussive transients aren't hitting like right here, and it basically goes dead for about 2 or 3 milliseconds before the drop occurs. That way the actual hit itself is more impactful, because really, yeah, it's really pretty simple when it comes down to doing good builds. I'll show you the transpose right here. See, I'm just pitching up the kick. Same with the snare. I have a gong reversing. I got these little static parts. And my vocals all pitched around. And that's it. It's really not that complicated. Now let's talk about how I like to mix down dubstep. Now when it comes to mixing down dubstep, one of the first and big things for me at least that I do is I don't actually touch the faders in the clip view in Ableton, meaning these right here. And the reason I do that is because I feel like when I'm changing the faders in the clip view in Ableton that I'm relying too much on all the visual representation that's happening and not using my ear as much. So the little trick that I do is I'll just adjust the faders on this side.
I'm not a rapper, but I'm a adapter.
Let's turn the kick and snare down.
I'm not a rapper, but I'm a adapter really does matter. And there's a
I just feel like doing it from this side in Ableton inside the arrangement view just forces you to rely on your ears more, and just for me personally, I feel like I get better mixes this way, and other people who I've told about this who have struggled to get decent mix downs after I've told them this trick have come back to me and said that this helped them a lot. So you can try this out. If you want to still, of course, use these, that's okay too. There's really no rules in music, but I just found that that helped me a lot. Now, another really big thing that helped me with getting my mix downs nice was mixing in mono. And mixing in mono basically just means that you're summing all the information from the left and right channel, the stereo field, into the middle. And you do that with a utility plugin at the end of your master bus.
I'm not a rapper,
mono.
Really does
and the reason I do this is because if you can get it to sound good in mono, it's going to sound amazing in stereo. Now, the entire time that I'm mixing and doing my level adjustments and EQing, I will switch it to stereo to listen to how it's sounding, just in case anything weird happens or I have any phasing issues, but most of the time it will be left in mono. The third thing I like to do when I'm doing my mix downs is I like to set my listening level to just below a speaking voice. So if you were speaking to someone who's maybe 3 feet away from you, just slightly lower than how you would speak to someone, or like how I'm speaking to you now, maybe at like this volume, that would be about where I would set my listening level. The reason you want to do this is 1, it helps with ear fatigue, and 2, it helps with the reflections bouncing around your room. And if you do not have a well-treated room, you're going to have to worry about the reflections affecting how your mix sounds a lot. And when you turn the listening level down, it will help reduce those reflections tremendously. Now, I set the kick to 0 because it should be the loudest element, but keep in mind the reason I'm doing that too is because I'm also mastering my own tracks. If you were to send off your track to a mastering engineer and your kick set to 0, they're not going to really be able to do too much with it as far as loudness goes, because they won't be able to crank the limiter hard enough to bring up the rest of the track. So if you're going to send your track out to a mastering engineer, you definitely need to set your kick to -6 decibels, and I'll give you an example of that now. So right now I have my kick and snare set to 0. You can see the snare is actually hitting a little bit over 0 decibels, but I have them bust together into this kick drum, snare drum, and they're actually hitting at -3 decibels, which usually I have it set to 0, which it would be up here. But I guess in this particular mix, I needed to lower it to make it sound good with everything else, which is okay too. Remember, there are no rules. Now, after I get the kick set to 0, I will then level in the snare. And usually the snare will be slightly louder than the kick just because it has all that high frequency content. But if it's too loud to where you don't like it, you can just bring it down with the fader as well. You don't want it to be too much quieter than the kick, but you don't want it to be too much louder to where the snare is just overpowering the kick. You want them to basically both have a nice, good, even balance. And a good way to do that is on your kick and snare bus, have a limiter on it, where it will be bringing up what's quiet in the kick and turning down what's louder in the snare, at least in this situation. Sometimes it'll be doing the exact opposite for the kick versus snare, snare versus kick. It depends on which one you want louder and how loud you have the fader set running into that limiter. Okay, so let's talk about saturating, limiting, and compressing your sounds into a group bus and why that's important. The reason why this is important is because if you're trying to get all of your sounds to have the same perceived level in volume, it's really hard to only do that with just the faders. I mean, you get like 95% of the way there, but the last way you kind of close that gap to get the sounds pretty much damn near perfect at the same volume is by doing some limiting on their group bus.
To start off with, all of the sounds already have saturation on them before we're even going to run them into the group bus. This one right here has trash 2, which is adding a bit of saturation, and in this right here in the FX section we got a little bit of tube saturation going on for this, and a little bit of saturation right here. Actually no, this is limiting on the turnaround, which is bringing it up to a more perceived volume.
My name is YellOut, I'll open my mouth.
All right, and then the way you get all of these sounds, because when you're mixing them, you're trying to get them as close to each other as possible as far as perceived loudness, but in order to close that gap, you group them together, and you're going to want to add a little bit of saturation and limiting on the group bus. So actually, I didn't do any saturation here, I just limited it, so let's take a look. Let's see what we got, and then we will duplicate this, turn this one off, that way we can actually see. So this one's going to be our reference point to be able to watch the waveforms, and this one's going to show us actually crushing the waveforms. See how there's a dip right there with the turnaround. These two are exactly where they're supposed to be, but this one is not quite there. And the way we can solve that is either by turning up the fader, you can see how we're a little bit closer. Do it again. And that sounds about where we want it to be. Another way we can do that instead of turning it up though is just by adding a saturator on there onto the individual sound, since this one doesn't have any. Does it not? No, it's got a little bit right there with the compressor. But you'll see how this limiter is just picking off the tops of the sound and basically slightly sausaging the group together, which is how you're getting them all at that perceived loudness. Because you'll see if I take it away, they're all at different levels again. They're close in level, but they're not that exact preciseness that you're kind of looking for to get all your bass sounds at that same perceived level of volume. And this process should really be the whipped cream on top of your ice cream, meaning that you mixing the faders and adding saturation and compression to the individual sounds and leveling them by ear should be the ice cream. And the whipped cream should be you doing this technique of sausaging all the sounds together as a group, but slightly, not overdoing it. You'll see we're bouncing between 3 and -1 decibels of gain reduction while we're doing this. which really isn't compressing it too hard. It's just rounding everything off at the top. Now let's talk about sidechaining and the two different ways that I like to do it. There's two different ways that I like to sidechain. One, and the most common one, is with Ableton's compressor. But another way that I like to do it is with Ableton's utility plugin, which I've renamed SideChaining right here. And all I'm doing is I'm automating the gain to duck when the kick is playing. So if I turn off the kick, you'll hear it ducking. And what that is doing is removing all that low frequency content to make room for the kick to punch through. And I did that simply by drawing in automation on Ableton. So if you have a flat line like this, what I like to do is come here, go to this little preset that Ableton has. I will drag it a couple bars over, then I will listen by ear. And then I will bring this curve over slightly and line it up to where it's just ducking only when the kick is playing. It should have a very slight pumping effect. So you can hear the bass kicking in too late, so now I can hear that I need to move it more forward. Better, but not perfect. And just listening, I can tell that I need to move this curve, make it a little bit more steep. And that should be good. Now the other way that I like to sidechain is with Ableton's compressor, but I use that more on the bass sounds than I do with the kick and the sub, because the kick and the sub have to be so precise, whereas with Ableton's compressor there's a little bit more room for error. But I'll show you how that technique works now. So what you're going to want to do is you want to go to Dynamics, grab Ableton's compressor, and throw it in here. Now we're going to want to do two of these, set them to sidechaining. We're going to input the audio from the kick, from the kick drum, and we're going to input the audio on the second one from the snare first. Then we're going to set the attack down just a bit because this is dubstep and we want it to punch in pretty quickly, so we'll set it at around here and we'll give it a listen. And let's do it really extreme so that you guys can hear the hi-hats ducking for the kick. Now I'm going to bring it up slowly. Now having the hi-hat duck for the kick is important, but not as important as the snare since they live in two different parts of the frequency spectrum. So let's do the snare now. Now we should hear the hi-hat ducking for both the kick and the snare. Now this is before, and now this is after. While the effect is just slight and minimal, you can hear that it sounds a lot cleaner and more tightened up. And then when you do this process over all the bass sounds, all the effects, over every single thing in the track, you'll hear that your mix gets a lot cleaner and a lot tighter. I would literally do this type of sidechain on every single element that's not the kick and the snare. Because in dubstep, there's always so much going on that it's really easy for the kick and snare to get lost in the mix. And by doing this sidechaining effect, it allows them to punch through drastically. But you don't want to put the sidechaining on the group buses. You want to do it individually on each sound. That way you have the maximum amount of control. And if you put them on the group bus to try and save time, you'll hear that it's ducking almost too much and gives it an unnatural kind of sound. Be forewarned. It's much better to take the time and do each of the sounds individually than to try and cheat and just put it on like the bass bus. While being a lot of extra work, it will make it a lot better. Trust me. Alright, so let's talk about EQing. Now I'm going to show you something that I've done that helps me a lot. And that is my default EQ in Ableton. So I'm going to double click the EQ8 and you'll see that mine's not set to the standard way that Ableton's naturally loads in, and I'll tell you why. So the first thing you'll notice is that I got a really sharp high pass curve set at 150 Hertz. And I do that because almost 90% of the stuff in my mix doesn't need to have any sub frequency content below 150 Hertz. So that just immediately cleans up my low end on every single thing that I'm EQing. And you should have this on every single one of your sounds that's not the kick and the sub. That way your low end's nice and tight. The next thing you'll notice is I have a low pass filter set to 11,000 kilohertz. And it's basically the exact same concept. I want to cut just about anything that's really up here in this high frequency content area other than the cymbals and China percussion. Doing this will keep my mix a lot less harsh and a lot cleaner in the top end. Basically, the only instruments you want up there are cymbals. And just being able to take this and load this in immediately saves me a ton of work. Because really for any of your dubstep bass sounds, you're not going to need any information up past here. Now you may notice when you load in your sounds that when you cut all this high frequency content up here, it makes the sound a lot more damp. But in the context of your overall mix, once you mix everything together, you'll notice that it cleans up your mix drastically, and all that frequency content that you removed will be filled up from the hi-hats and the other cymbal percussion elements. But if you're not planning on having any cymbal percussion elements, you could probably move this up a little bit more, around 14 to 16 kilohertz to fill up that space. But that's only if you're removing that stuff. And honestly, you can afford to bring this down to around 7,000 kilohertz, but I usually don't go much lower than that. Again, I do most of this by ear, which I will show you now. So right here around 9.41 kilohertz is where this curve sounds like it's sitting good. And like I said before, I don't need anything below 150 hertz. There's nothing going on down here that's necessary to keep, because I'm going to fill it all up with a sub bass later anyways. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about is notching out high frequency content. As you can see, I've already done it on this channel, but I'm going to go ahead and do it again to show you how much it actually cleans everything up. What I like to do is take this button here on Ableton's EQ, which basically just solos the band that you're playing with, drag it up, notch it like this, and then basically you sweep for frequencies that suck, is basically the best way to put it. Turn your listening volume up, that way you can really hear where the sharp frequencies are, and then you just turn them down. But you need to be careful when doing this that you don't overdo it, because then you'll start to lose some of the life from your mix. I'll show you right now how I do it. Take that and bring it down. That's a good one right there. As you see, we're basically just looking for the frequencies that hurt your ears and suck. Frequencies to look out for are the frequencies usually in the 300 range, because they're pretty muddy. The 700 range, because it's kind of like, they like to call it the submarine range, because it's like the same frequency that submarines send out their blip sounds. It's a kind of like a muddy-ish kind of sound. And also look out for the 4,000 kilohertz range, because that's where a lot of frequencies are pretty harsh. And that's also the frequencies at which babies cry. Random science fact. See right there, that 4,000 kilohertz range is pretty sharp. So now let's listen to before and after, and actually let's throw in. So this is before I notch everything out. This is after. You can hear how it sounds cleaner, but it also sounds a little bit more damp and lifeless, and the way that I like to counteract this is to pull back on the scale, which is basically like the wet dry for your EQ. Now we can hear the original one, it's a little harsh. And we can hear that this one cleans it up a bit, but because I pulled it back on the scale, it still has a little bit of that life and brightness left into it. This was a huge thing that helped me really clean up my mixes by removing those harsh frequencies. I do this on just about every single individual sound, as well as the overall master bus. I can't stress enough how important this is. But be careful when doing this and balancing it with the scale, aka the wet dry. You don't want to kill the life and the feeling of your mix, but you also don't want it to be too harsh and too ear fatiguing. And a great way to really find out if you did this correctly is by testing your mix on AirPods or EarPods or any type of in-ear headphone, because these really stick out on those smaller speakers. Also, using de-essers on your bass sounds will help with the harshness a lot, but I usually use the de-essers on the bass sounds group bus. But if I have a sound that is particularly rough, I will put the de-esser directly on that sound. Now I'm going to give you guys a tool completely for free in the description of this video called the Magic MixDown reference rack that I built personally. And what it does, it allows you to A/B stuff from mono to stereo, and it also gives you 6 reference points for how your mix sound. You have a mid-low, a high-mid, a low-pass, and a high-pass, and then an outsider room. And I'll show you how each of these sound. This is normal. This is normal. This is mono. This is mid-low. This is high-mid. This is the low pass. This is the high pass. And this is the outsider room, which is basically designed to allow you to listen to what your mix would sound like outside of a building or outside of a club. And I also have this sweep filter. All of these buttons of which, of course, in Ableton are programmable. I like to program the mono to the M key, and I like to program the mid-low, the high-mid, the low-pass, the high-pass in the outside room to shift 1, shift 2, shift 3, shift 4, and shift 5. That way, while I'm mixing, I can just toggle these bandpass filters and the low and high-pass filters on and off with just the click of a key. Now, the reason I use this tool and the reason I built this tool is because when you're mixing with your faders and you're making all these volume adjustments, but you're focusing on a particular part of your track, like let's say you're just mixing the bass sounds, you don't need to be listening to what's going on with the sub and what's going on with the high end. And it becomes a lot easier to mix the stuff when you're just focusing on those individual parts of the track. So if I was to be mixing just these sounds, it becomes easier for me to get them to the levels that I want them to be at because my brain's not focusing on all the other stuff that's going around. Now, you don't just do this, okay? This is a reference, okay? You want to be switching back and forth the entire time. You don't want to just section off each of the individual parts and then mix the sections by themselves without listening to how it sounds like in the context of the entire mix, or it's going to be completely fucked up. You do not want to do that. You do this basically, as I said, as a reference. While you're mixing, it should really sound like this. So you're like, huh, that sounds a little off. Okay, that sounds a little better. Now let's go back to how it sounds in the mix. And as you can hear, it wasn't perfect. So now I know, while listening to it in the context of the mix, it could probably go up another decibel. And I was right. See, always trust your ears. To go back and forward, not as the final say. So basically, you would use the mid-low and the high-mid for mixing your bass and mid-range sounds. You would, oh my god, what the fuck? You would, I can't fucking say it, what the fuck? You could then use the low pass to mix the kick and the sub, like how I was showing you guys the sidechain earlier. You could then use the high pass to mix in the hi-hats and all the China percussion elements to the overall mix. In the outside of room, I like to listen to when I'm trying to compare what the bass sounds sound like in context with the kick. Basically, when I have that filter turned on, it's easier for me to hear what's louder, the kick or the bass sounds, because your bass sound should be about 1 or 2 decibels lower than what the kick is, as a general rule of thumb, but then again, the rules can be broken. Okay, now I'm going to go over my master bus. Your master bus doesn't have to be set up the way that I set mine up, but I'm just going to go through my plugins and tell you what they're doing and why they're doing it. You can do this or not. This is just how I like to set up my master chain. Okay, so now I'm going to go over what's going on in my master bus. The first thing I have is a utility plugin with negative 10.4 decibels of gain reduction, which is bringing the overall signal from all the groups down so I can run it into my master chain. First thing I got going on is a transient shaper set to 2.5 decibels of gain. All this is doing is it's making all the transients punch through a little bit harder. Next thing I got is a standard Pro Q3 from FabFilter. I'm cutting a lot of the mud in the 3 to 400 section, the 700 to 600 section, and the 4000 kilohertz section, removing some of those harsh frequencies, also boosting the kick and the snare, boosting the mid-range a bit, as well as the high range. Don't just copy this completely. You do it by ear when you're actually mastering your own stuff. This is kind of what it will usually end up looking like anyways. Something close and around this. Not always, but sometimes. Next thing, I got a FabFilter Pro C2, and in this particular track, it is absolutely fucking murdering the dynamic range. It has 6 to 7 decibels of gain reduction, sometimes 8. But this is pretty typical in dubstep and a lot of the much louder genres. After that, we got it running into a saturator with 1 decibel of drive, and it's only set to 24.6 dry wet. I have an ozone exciter turned off, and I have a serum effects turned off. Those are used more for distortion effects and reverb effects. This is like special stuff that I don't use too often. In fact, I've only ever used both of those on 2 tracks. The next thing we have is a multi-band stereo imager. First band is set 0 to 250 hertz. Next one's 250 to 2000 kilohertz, then 2000 kilohertz to 8000 kilohertz, then 8000 and up. And you'll see the bands are slowly getting higher and higher as it goes up the frequency spectrum, meaning it's wider at the top and then completely mono at the bottom. That should be set to completely mono. And the reason you want everything set to completely mono at anything below 250 hertz is so that your stuff sounds good in the club and you don't have phasing issues, and a whole other list of reasons. Now moving on from the imager, I have mid-side EQ set to side, and I'm cutting all the side information out of the low end, which is just, it's making it more mono. But I really only use this when I need to make a particular part of the frequency spectrum wide, where I will come in here and I will guide it around where I just want it to be a little bit wider. But I really don't use this all too much. Next thing, I got some EQ where I'm just notching out some parts of the frequency spectrum that were a little harsh. Got some more notch filtering, then another EQ with a little bit more notch filtering. I like to separate my EQs like this, that way I can A/B the results. After that, I have a FabFilter Pro de-esser, which is de-essing everything from 2000 kilohertz up. You can hear right here all the harsh frequency content that is removing. And last but not least, I have my master limiter that's removing about 1 to 3 decibels of gain reduction. And that's it. I also need to, in this project, make sure my dithering set to 16-bit CD medium, and then medium. And then after that, of course, I have the magic MixDown reference point, and all this stuff right here is just referencing tools that I use to make sure everything is exactly where I want it to be. And that's it. Now I'm going to go through a couple more tips real quick here at the end of the video that I feel like need to be said. One of the things I wish I knew when I first started making bass music was to saturate the bass. And what does that do? Basically, it allows you to hear the sub bass on smaller speakers such as cell phones, laptops, and AirPods. And literally the saturator I use for this is Saturator in Ableton with 0 drive, and it's set to 13.5 dry wet in this case. It'll be different depending on the song, but it adds just enough saturation to where you can actually hear the bass pop out a little bit more. It makes it sound more full and thick. Another cool trick I learned over the years was putting a little bit of white noise underneath your kicks and snares to make them punch through the mix if your mix is really cluttered. And I don't do this too often because I'm pretty good at getting my mixes nice and clean now, but if your mixes aren't too clean and they are still a little cluttered up, 1, listen to the tips and tricks I told you in this video. 2, if you put a little bit of white noise under the kick and snare, and I mean real low, like it's probably going to be like negative 20 decibels in the mix, just like a little white noise. You can get that from Serum if you have it in the noise oscillator, and you just have just a little bit of that only playing when the kick and the snare hit. It'll make them appear louder in the overall mix. Third thing I want to talk about is keeping your percussive crash cymbals and China elements, anything that's brass, really low in the mix. Especially if you have a lot of these elements playing at one, it will really build up a lot of that harsh frequency content really quickly and you won't realize. And this will shine through especially well on smaller speakers, so keep that in mind. You want to basically just sort of barely hear it in the track. Not barely hear it, but it shouldn't be that loud, and it's really easy to get carried away with that. Now I want to talk to you about how hard you should crank your limiter. This is a really kind of confusing thing that people find when they first start making dubstep, because stereotypically rock and roll mixing and mastering engineers will tell you that you shouldn't be cranking your limiter too hard, and that completely goes out the window when it comes to electronic dance music, and especially dubstep, because by design dubstep is an extremely compressed, sausaged genre. It is supposed to not be that dynamic because everything is supposed to be in your face. That is how the genre is built by design, okay? Like most rock engineers will tell you not to crank your limiter to where the RMS is going past -7 or -8. But honestly, to get your stuff that loud with dubstep, it's got to be like -3 to -5. And I'll show you right here. You'll see that the RMS there was bouncing between -3 and -5, but yet it still doesn't sound distorted and crushed like a normal rock song would at those levels, because this is not rock and roll, this is dubstep. It is designed differently. We do our mix downs differently than rock mixers do, and that is okay. It's just a massive thing that confuses people at first when they start making dubstep. So basically what I like to do when it comes to cranking the threshold is I'll crank it to the point where it really starts distorting, and then I'll bring it down slowly. I'll bring it down slowly to the point where it stops distorting, and usually by doing that, my RMS will land somewhere between -3 RMS and -6 RMS, which is a pretty good level and will get you up to the competition level of other dubstep artists if you're trying to compete for loudness, aka the loudness war. That's pretty much over now. Now I'm going to talk about the final stages of my mixing and mastering process and how listening to your mixes on different systems really helps you tone in and get a really good mix. And I'll explain how I do that. So The first thing I usually do is I will test how my mix sounds on AirPods, because then I'll really hear all those harsh frequencies kind of sticking out, and I'll write notes of what part of the songs that those frequencies are coming out, so that I know to go in there and notch out those frequencies with an EQ. But then after that, I'll test how my mix sounds in the car, I'll test it on my studio headphones, I'll test on my laptop speakers, then I'll write down everything that needs to be fixed, and I'll A/B everything. I'll write down what sticks out and what system they are on, and then I will try to fix what's wrong, just to make sure that the mix translates well on all systems. I find that AirPods or in-ear headphones are great for finding the harsh frequencies, and I find that over-the-ear headphones are great for judging how loud the bass is in comparison to the track, and by bass I mean the sub. And then after I test it in all those different systems and I can get the mix to sound good in my car, on my headphones, in my studio headphones, on the laptop, I will just stop mixing completely and I will wait about 1 to 2 weeks. And the reason I do that is because I've been working on the song so much, you start to not know what sounds good or bad anymore, and you need a lot of time to decompress from making and mixing the song to allow your brain to reset. And I used to try to do this after 3 or 4 days, but I really found that the golden time for this to work really well is about 2 weeks, honestly. And in that time, I'll work on other songs. I might mix and do other songs, but then after that, I'll come back to the song, the first song, and then I'll listen to it on all the systems again. And if I don't find anything wrong with it, hell yeah, we're good to go. But usually I'll come back and I'll find 1 or 2 things that are just slightly off. I'll fix those and then I know it's done. And after that, I'll usually wait another 2 or 3 weeks before I decide that it is finally time to release the track. And now you know how to make dubstep.